Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Looking for the Light. I am your co-host, Michael Ablip, with my good friend Axel Hamill, here to break down another episode of The Last of Us HBO series for y'all tonight. We had a very interesting episode today to discuss with y'all a very big shift away from the Last of Us game itself. And we are definitely looking forward to discussing it with y'all. Please make sure to like the video, subscribe to Axel's channel, and leave a comment down below. Let's get a discussion going about this episode because it is, again, a very different episode from what we were kind of expecting, though maybe some of us were expecting this, given all the hype and talk and media coverage that was leading up to the airing of this ep. So we'll see how it goes. Once again, my name is Michael Ablif with my co-host Axel Hamill. Looking for the Light is a podcast about The Last of Us for Last of Us fans by Last of Us fans. So we come talking about each episode as diehard fans who have enjoyed the video game and very much so into the lore around this world and looking to gain as much as we can from the episode and from the show as a whole. So, going into this episode, we definitely had quite a little bit of a change up from what uh, the game had, and especially what I think we have been experiencing thus far in the first two episodes. There was a lot of conversation in the reviews of this episode, or the show as a whole, that the third episode was going to be the most different from the game, most different from the show as a whole, but also a lot of hype that this was going to be the best episode. According to the critics, this is the most significant, the most impactful episode out of the build up to what we might assume the finale might be. And it was interesting to see how it wound up being played out, delving into a rather small but crucial character in the story from the video game, and building out their entire backstory, um, and introducing a character that was not living in the video game and developing their backstory as well as kind of further galvanizing this world and giving it more believability. Uh, so definitely an interesting third episode to the series, and we're going to look forward on breaking down this conversation into our three usual categories as we always do: the world, the characters, and the homage. So first of all, I want to throw it over to Axel. Let's get this conversation going about the world. So we didn't have too much uh, broken down for us as far as the world goes outside of Bill's town. We only very much get a perspective on what Bill's town is within the frames of his house and the fencing that he has put up around it. Very different from what we have in the game, where in the game Bill's town is completely booby trapped. We don't really see much of what exists outside of the town, but we do get a very nice subtle touch to Bill's church, which is what his home is in the game. Is the church is within the properties of the fencing, so we still paying homage to the game in some sorts, and we'll be touching on that later on in the episode. But the world itself isn't too much uh, further put into a panorama for us. But one thing that we definitely do get in this episode. We were hinted at it or almost clearly given it in the last episode, but it was very much so solidified for us in this episode. The flower theory is 100% true, Axel. We got Joel explaining it to Ellie that it went through flour, maybe sugar, easily uh, found ingredients in many products that you will pick up at the grocery store, being that it broke out in Jakarta, potentially being the site of Patient Zero, that being the spot where it spread, and it was able to highlight it in the show where the globalized market that we have today, it was very easy to spread, combined with the increase of temperature on the planet. It created this perfect environment, so to speak, within this world, and the cordyceps virus was able to mutate and cause pandemonium across the planet. And we had Joel very clearly articulate that. So the world in this episode was just a little bit further built out for us. What were some of the impressions that you had, Axel, from this episode as far as establishing the world uh, that the show is portraying, and that creator Neil Druckmann of the video game director at Naughty Dog also said that this TV show is a further extension to some degree of the game as well. What did you take of the world from this episode as it's further explained for us?
Amazing summary, Mike. Echoing on the fact that there's some interesting little factual elements we found out for the first time on this episode. Keeping in mind that there's a couple of things that for new coming fans you should know about is that, again, the storyline in this TV show is nothing that you would expect in the video game, right? So I think in its own right, it's paving way for a lot more TV show-esque environments, and I think that's exactly what we need right now. Is a beautiful artwork that is showing how vastly different the world it can be when it in this kind of environment where most of the population has been wiped out and you're just trying to survive. So paying attention to sort of the storyline at the beginning of the episode, we see Ellie and Joel kind of on foot leaving Boston to the outskirts of the city. We understand how people communicate in this realm. It's a lot by radio. There's a small little hint in the episode that other people can listen in on your conversations. So you have this survivalist mentality where you really have to be specific on how you communicate and what you communicate, whether it's by code or music, even, as they were alluding to on episode 1 and episode 3. We get the perfect idea of how the virus had been spreading around the world. So even the smallest things, the basic ingredients, flour, sugar, bread, all these kind of things were adding up, and Joel put this perfectly. Thursday, Friday morning is when people bought these items. They ingested these items. By Friday night, they started biting. And by Monday, the following Monday, everything was gone. That's how quickly everything turned around. So think about this world in a contrast of themes a little bit. So every flashback we've had so far, we get this buildup of hopelessness in the world. We get an idea of how much fear there was in a world where the virus is out, the outbreak is starting. What can happen if the fungus evolves to that point? Literally in the last episode, we saw a professor in the field literally say, "Hey, let's bomb the city, otherwise we're not going to survive this." And in this episode, we find out in a flashback specifically that some survivors actually were going to the QZ, but there was no room. Then you would literally be killed off, and they would just leave the bodies in the side of the road. So you can definitely tell that the world was very cruel to one another, and it still is. But you can definitely see that element of hopelessness, the fear factor that people went through. On the side of Bill, too, in the world, Bill's town is definitely interesting. For one thing, Bill is a survivalist. He went around, waited for everyone to leave town to make his move and establish himself in that town with all the resources that he had. Claimed to be self-sufficient. We didn't really learn too much about the environment Bill was living aside from that. I mean, the rest of the story of the TV show took place in literally his house and the fence around the house. But what you can probably imagine is that Bill is interesting and the world is interesting because nobody would come looking for you, right? He was self-sufficient enough to fend off against intruders to an extent. And the one person that did find him ended up being one of his romantic interest, and we can talk about that a little bit later. But I think that's what makes this episode so interesting, is that there were a lot of context clues around what happened, how it happened, and the inclusivity of one person living in as a survivalist within this world. So, Mike, I think the interesting part about this episode is that there's a lot of character development here for just these two characters that we hardly hear about in the games, honestly. Total 180, I mean, lack of a better term, Bill's an asshole in the games, right? And so to see some empathy shown to one another, creating that sense of love of the original theme of the first game and emphasizing that in its own right, has a dramatic impact in the rest of the story. I think not too much else to talk about the world itself here, but we can definitely dive into a lot of the character development in this story. Would
Absolutely. You agree? Yeah, no, absolutely agree, Axel. What the world definitely got, a very proper, strike on the nail head, if you will, where we definitely had that stake be driven quite a bit deeper in our understanding for what the world is. How more, I think, clearly with every single episode, it's going to be further and further explained in either small little dialogue that the characters will have or details that we'll be able to pick up on, that the writers of the show might have a subtle slip as far as a comment that one of the characters will say that honestly will be able to very much so amplify kind of the grounding of the setting for this show. But you make a very, very good transition, I would say, to discussing more of how deep the character development is in this episode. Predominantly for two characters, one of whom is, again, not alive even in the game, and the other who we find out very little about. One thing I want to very quickly pause on, and, obviously we have fans watching this show right now who are both veteran fans of The Last of Us and jumping into the TV show for the first time altogether. And to those fans, I say, you guys are crazy. You should just watch the rest of the HBO show once it's done, then go back and watch all of our podcast, and then also play the video game at the same time. It's a very good hand-in-hand kind of adventure that you can take with us, the hosts of Looking for the Light.
In that exact order, too, people. In that exact order as well.
But one thing that I need to kind of talk to our hardcore Last of Us fans about is the fact that aside from, let's think about it real quick, Joel and Ellie, who we don't get a whole lot of backstory on them, we just get so-called current gameplay experiences of them with, a good number of jumps in there as well, but not a whole lot of backstory development on either of the characters. You get Ellie's so-called flashback in the Left Behind DLC, and for Joel, you get small comments that he says here and there that kind of builds out his backstory, but a lot of that is kind of left up to the imagination of the viewer, the consumer of the product itself. So there's not a whole lot there in the game, where as opposed to in the show, in very subtle comments, we're learning so much about the characters. Not so much about Ellie, and it's something that maybe we'll touch on later on in this episode. But for Joel, we get a lot more information about him, his backstory, and I'm sure it's going to be a lot like that for the rest of the show itself. Obviously, we got that for Sarah, but Sarah's a short character, so we don't get to very much so expand on that. But we did get more than we did in the game. Tess, we know where Tess is from. We have a lot more backstory when it comes to Tess. Bill and Frank, this is so much telling to a story where for us as consumers of the game, we had nothing really to base off of when it came to Bill. He was just a character who pops in, has an attitude, helps Joel. We find out a little bit about him and his backstory that, most of us probably didn't see that coming. But there's not a whole lot of character development there, as opposed to here through this platform, not a video game but a show. You can very much so build upon those character dynamics, make them complicated, complex characters, and give them depth and a core. I think they did a splendid job in this episode of delving out the character that is Bill and Frank and making a believable and justifiable diversion away from the video game as far as telling Bill's story, but still kind of reign true and pay to it some homage to the game. There are some pretty significant differences, Axel, as we have both noted. Bill was an asshole in the show. He's still an asshole, but he's a willing to change asshole, and he does evolve, throughout the show. The show covers Bill from about 20 years. We first see Bill immediately after the outbreak, and then we see Bill maybe a couple of weeks before Joel and Ellie show up to his house. So we get, obviously not the full 20 years, but we get very solid flashpoints of his life without Frank, with Frank, as he was growing with Frank as well. It's a very interesting depiction to Bill. We get so much depth to him in very, very subtle ways as well. There are some correlations here between the Bill in the show and the Bill in the game, because it's honestly very hard to call them the same. The Bill in the game doesn't die. He says goodbye to Joel and Ellie, and then he returns back to his church or his home, the church which was his home in the game. His character in theory lives on in the video game's universe. In the show's universe, if we want to draw a line between these two being very different, he doesn't live. So there's some pretty significant backstory there. We also get hints to the home, how Bill was living himself within the home, how isolated he was. It was never clearly drawn out in the game that Bill was any kind of survivalist, that Bill was any kind of a prepper. But in the show, it's very clear that Bill is a hardcore prepper. He was hardcore preparing for this long before the cordyceps virus mutated. His stockpile of guns, his stockpile of supplies, his handiwork and capability of survival and understanding of how to set up traps and fencing as well. It goes to show that he's a very, very deep character who has this personality to them. That's something that they were able to really build out in the show, that you really couldn't get in the game. One thing, Axel, that I thought was pretty interesting that was also caught on, Nick Offerman's portrayal of Bill, which was phenomenal, by the way. There were very subtle little hints throughout the episode that showed that the house that Bill lives in the show happened to be his mother's house, and that she presumably had passed away at some point in time. So Bill remained in this childhood home that he had lived in, for the entirety of his life, and how kind of isolated he is as a character is very interesting. A lot of people on the internet were pulling correlations between Bill and how Nick Offerman portrayed him to Ron Swanson from Parks and Recreation, and how Nick Offerman portrayed him. Very similar characters, but with this one very key difference, that Bill seems to be a hardcore recluse, and Nick Offerman, you can't say that he was a recluse, but you also couldn't say that he was necessarily an extroverted character. But this build out for the character of Bill in this show is pretty astounding, and gave him a lot more layers. Very different from the game, but I don't think Neil Druckmann and Craig Mazin wanted to portray Bill as such a hard-nosed, stubborn, selfish idealist as he is in the game. I give him a lot more complexity in the show. Love to hear what your takes were, Axel, of Nick Offerman's portrayal of Bill, and kind of the big divergence that we're seeing in the show for the character of Bill. Not to mention, this is going to be the only time we're probably ever going to see him. It's not like there's probably going to be any flashbacks to Bill. Nothing significant happened between Joel and Ellie with Bill, since they never got to meet, or Ellie never got to meet him living. So it's a pretty interesting one episode steal the show kind of performance from Nick Offerman. Sorry, wanted to shoot that over to you.
I want to start off by saying a couple of things. Number one, I hope I'm not the only one whose jaw dropped to the floor when I saw more of a romantic involvement between Bill and Frank. I was genuinely shocked, but in a good way. I think that I was not expecting that, for lack of a better term. I think ultimately it just drew in this emotional weight to the story right away. So a couple of things that I want to mention about that as well is that if you haven't noticed, number one, nearly every character we've seen portrayed in The Last of Us so far has been a recycled HBO actor. Would love to.
Very good point.
Love to see people's comments about this. Can you identify all of them and from where they are? What shows they're from?
But you're not being critical of them hiring, like, I'm curious whether or not a lot of these actors are under, like, HBO contracts or something like that, so they have to portray, participate in a certain amount of HBO productions or whatever. You're not, like, harking on them for having so many HBO faces, are you?
No, I'm not harking on that. I think that it's a good thing to have some trust and verification with the people you've worked with. I just find it really funny, and maybe I'm the only one who feels this way, that when you see a character's face that you've seen elsewhere in a show with the same network, Bella Ramsey, Game of Thrones, or Murray Bartlett from...
Whoa. Let's see if some of our fans can comment down in the comment section below if they can call out everyone who is in The Last of Us, who also is in another HBO show. What character did they play too? You can't give them all away, Axel. You said a Bella Ramsey... And, who was the second actor that you had mentioned?
Murray Bartlett.
Murray Bartlett from White Lotus. Okay. All right, let's see if the fans can call out the rest of them. But good observation, actually. Yeah, definitely a lot of HBO faces on this show. HBO just showing off that they're the GOAT, being able to pull off so many great shows. Obviously Game of Thrones was a major success. White Lotus was very binge-worthy television, that's for sure. Continue.
I think creative differences from our perspective to theirs, but kudos to them for really killing it on the casting again. Here's what I think. Ultimately, the story between Bill and Frank was the big divergence from the game, but in a good way. So I agree with you. Bella Ramsey's portrayal of Ellie has yet to be seen at its full capacity. I think there's a lot to unpack there. We have 6 more episodes to do so. Not going to spend a lot of time on that quite yet. What I will say, though, in the very entry scene of the episode with Ellie's dynamic of the infected in the basement, you can kind of see her cold-hearted nature at the same time. So Ellie is, while at the same time the comedic relief we need in this type of world, you can definitely tell she's been through a lot in her past, because she would not even flinch from the notion that there's an infected right in front of her, and she knew exactly what to do. In that sense, I think you can sort of start to understand and unravel that she's not just some common girl, and there's a lot more to her than that. She's tough.
Absolutely.
She's tough. And the same thing goes for Joel. I think that's why they're such a good pair with one another, is that they both hold a certain degree of emotional weight. And in its contrast, Bill in the story again of The Last of Us game is an asshole. He is a brilliant scientist. He's a craftsman, for lack of a better term. He can fend off hordes of infected with his gadgets. However, in comparison to the TV show, I think this is the monumental divide between what the game story is that we know and love versus TV show story. And I think the big reason for that is, and it's one of the things we talked about in the first episode of our podcast, is that they wanted to make the story a lot less gamey, right? The patience you need in the game it's relevant because you have tutorials. You have to understand the gameplay mechanics. You have to understand the background of how to use your tools. an environment to your advantage. You don't need to do that in a TV show or a movie for that matter. You just need to get straight to the point, and you need to tell the same story in its own right. And I think that's why this story of Bill and Frank was really kind of, it was a solid story. It was a beautiful story to be told, to re-display the theme of love in The Last of Us, right?
Right.
So from that standpoint, I think seeing Bill open up with empathy to an outside person was really great character development. The romantic interest really built up to the finale of the episode, which was, "Hey Joel, protect what you find most important in your life." And we know that he felt at that moment that he failed with Tess, and so he knew that to hold on to Tess's legacy, he needed to protect Ellie moving forward, get her where she needs to go, and be that hope for him and the universe and all that good stuff, right? So I think this is both the monumental episode for the divergence of the story from the original Last of Us game, and also the monumental story to move us forward, the dynamic between Joel and Ellie, and in this survivalist story.
Right. Yeah, I think something that you brought up is it's important to kind of to explain ourselves a little bit when we say Bill is an asshole in the game as opposed to here in the show. That the clearest depiction of that, if we draw a comparison between the two, is at the end of the game when Joel is parting away from Bill. Their interaction is essentially, Bill is, "I don't know what the heck you're doing with this girl, but, just do whatever you got to do. Look out for yourself. That's the most important thing. There's no point looking out for other people because you can't. Just look out for yourself." In the show, Bill's last remarks to Joel are completely different. They are, "Find something that's worth living for and do all that you can to protect that." Because that's the one thing that is worth living life. That's what's actually going to bring you away from just survival and actually into, an element of being able to live. So that very clear difference that we have between the game and the show, it's interesting that they did that. I'm curious to see, maybe why they did that. This is pretty early on. Edit that out, please. This is very early on in the game where Bill is able to still be a character within the story arc of the game. When it's so early on, Bill can be kind of a negative character. He's obviously doing positive things. He gets them a car battery, he gets them moving, yada, yada, yada. But his contribution to the theme of the story within the game itself, he can be kind of a negative character in that sense. In the show, we're 3 episodes in now. Bill is the opposite. He is a positive character that is pushing something, a narrative, if you will, within this story. So they're introducing this element of, there's a reason to survive, and the reason to survive is to find people that are worth living for. And that's very interesting that we're getting that big difference as far as the story arc of the game and the story arc of the show. Because early on, the storytellers, in this case, Neil Druckmann and Craig Mazin, they're pushing this kind of like an early positive chapter within the story. And it's interesting to see where this is going to play out further on.
Really good point. I think also another thing that us in the audience need to consider is that Nick and Murray are both comedians. So they're acting.
Are they?
Yes, they are. And you know what the funny thing is? They even mentioned this in...
Well, I know...
In...
Sorry. Sorry, go ahead.
The funny thing is about the whole attribute of comedians is that they actually can portray the weight of life in the best way. They're very realistic in displaying emotions. right? Because they
For sure.
realize they can joke about it so well, the negative aspects of life, that they can portray it in the the best way possible on screen. That's
Right.
why Nick and Murray were the best actors for these two characters. Both the sadistic, negative, you know, lack of emotion person
Right.
is Bill. Then you have Murray, who's sort of this, hey, I'm in the same situation as you. I've been through hell and back, but
Right.
I can bring you to a positive light. You
Right.
know, so I think that's why these two pairs of comedians were the best for these two roles. And maybe you can disagree with that, but I think that's an interesting casting choice, and I think it was the best casting choice for these two characters. So
For sure. For sure. I think you definitely drive a very good point. I had not thought of it like that. Um, Very interesting, casting as well for these two characters, and I think there was some comedic relief to their portrayals of Bill and Frank too. It made it a very lighthearted episode.
gauging on the relationship between Bill and Frank and Joel and Tess. So we have a very brief interaction between the couples there, but it wasn't distinctly mentioned. But it was also mentioned that they were a situation in this part of the episode. Very interesting, by the way, because that was never portrayed in the game. But I love that they added that on there as a little tack on. One thing that we learn about Joel is that, and Bill, is that Joel is the one person in the world aside from Frank that he trusts. Bill even mentions when they get raided and he gets shot to call Joel. That's how much he trusts this outside person. Call Joel. Last breath.
Joel.
And Joel immediately is at a higher level of survival knowledge than Bill is. You can tell that Joel knows how to navigate a situation when he's in a pickle. Basically, he could look at the fence, 5 minutes, told him exactly what he needed to do to make that even more
100%.
foolproof, right?
100%. Yeah.
So I think that was very interesting. They added those little details of how much Joel and Tess have essentially seen around the world and how much of an advantage they have as they are smugglers by nature,
Right.
and how much they could work together since Bill and Frank can provide shelter and certain other elements like more, I guess, freedom for food specifically. And then as smugglers, they can trade items they have in an environment that can actually have more of a supply of items, right? So I think that was an interesting dynamic. Again, talking about the world and character development, is that we never really saw the working relationship between the four of them.
Yeah. 100%. Yeah. Very good point there too. Also, I think it's good on them to kind of not be. Not be dumb to the fact that when who Joel is as a character, because when Joel takes a look at Bill's fence, Joel was a contractor before. He was a carpenter as far as we understand. So him looking at construction in that kind of like eye, as far as what can be done to improve things, to make them better, to make them safer. They played into that. They played into that character. Piece as well in this episode. So that kind of also ties into the character development, the world as well as a whole, but also that homage too. I think we need to round out this conversation on the episode. It was definitely a deep episode when it comes to the character development and more further establishing of the world. But the last thing is the homage. Now we've talked about how this episode takes quite a few steps away from the game in a lot of ways. That homage isn't necessarily there if we're to say this is supposed to be a one-to-one portrayal of Bill from the game, because it's not. It's a very different Bill. It's a Frank that we had never met or experienced at all in the game, aside from a note that he leaves at the very end, which shows that Frank and Bill did not have the most amicable relationship, at least towards the very end. But there are still some subtle homages, in the episode for the show. Speaking of that note, that's the same note, in a sense, if you will, that Frank leaves behind for Bill, that Bill winds up crumpling up. In this case, this note is left from Bill to Joel, and Joel winds up crumpling it up at the very end. So in a sense, that's a homage there too. The Chevy S10 pickup truck, 100% taken from the game. A lot of the clothing that that Ellie and Joel are at least leaving Bill's home wearing, that's a lot of the clothes that they're wearing in the game as well. Subtle homages. Ellie's pistol that she also takes from Bill. Homage in the sense that it's the same pistol, not a homage in the sense that Ellie gets it on her own, technically kind of like stealing it and hiding it from Joel, as opposed to in the game, Joel gives it to her. So, homage in a sense, also diluting away from the game. Interesting. There's a couple other homages in the show as well that throw back to the game as well. Axel, did you catch any in particular that were that really caught your eye?
Those are really good points, Mike. I think I want to take a step back and say one thing.
Shoot for it.
I was actually at first very disappointed with the fact that it was a separate story from the homage of the game. And having talked to a few other friends of mine, I think I had a chance to kind of expand on that notion a little bit. I think my mentality at first was very close-minded. It's like I was really expecting a lot of that one-to-one replication for the game. But what I realized was that, like I said before, I think it works in our benefit to have a story that's basically original from what we saw in the game. And I think, again, there's a few elements I'm going to mention in just a second what I thought were one-to-one replications for the game. But I think to set ourselves in what we now know as the Last of Us universe on a TV screen is now its own original path, right? There's going to be a lot of differences we're going to start seeing moving forward that are using the original source material. But for now, I was originally disappointed, but now I'm starting to really love it. The fact that they're being original. I think that's the expectation we should have moving forward, is being open-minded to these types of changes to carry more emotional weight and more of that original theme. Because at the end of the day, the theme is the same. It's love and the hope in a lost universe, basically, where everything is torn apart. Same thing in the first game as it is in a TV show. It's just a different way of portraying it. That's what we should take away from this, if there's anybody else thinking the same way. Now, what I will say, though, is, again, the only affected in the game portrayed almost one-to-one to what you'd see in the game. Another thing, too, is when you look at sort of the empty store in the very beginning scene of the episode, exactly what you would see in the game, right? You're scavenging for items, you're looking for places, the way they're even grabbing and moving things aside, like that's exactly what you'd see in the game. Like, kudos to that detail. That was fantastic. I'm going to just exclude a lot of the parts that we saw in character development. We talked heavily on that. Emphasis on the very, very last act of the episode. We talk about Joel and Ellie actually getting in there. We get the letter. Similar theme as what we would see in the game, but again, it's portrayed more towards the relationship between Joel and Ellie, and that's totally fine. But what really got me was, quote unquote, 3 rules that Joel puts in front of Ellie. Number 1, you do what as I say when I say it. Number 2, you don't talk about Tess ever. And number 3, you don't show the bite mark. Otherwise, they will shoot you, no questions asked. And the way Ellie says, what do you say, goes, I even got goosebumps. I'm not going to lie. I think that was exactly what he would hear in the game. So,
100%.
Great portrayal there. 100% one-to-one. Love it. Again, looking at the costume changes for Joel and Ellie. Ellie's shirt, everybody who plays the game would know exactly what she's wearing right there. The tropical palm tree and the red background, the sunset theme. Absolutely love it. Rocking it. And then here comes Joel with the usual flannel the green flannel as you'd normally see in a game. I think that itself is homage to the fact that you can change costumes in the game depending on the environment, right? So love that fact they added that little element in there. Definitely the representation we really needed in the show so far. And they got the truck, and in the very, very, very last scene of the episode where they drive off and you see the window with the drapes and kind of that pan out. Let's be honest. You've seen this in...
If you played the game, yeah.
If you played the game,
Axel, go ahead.
If you've played the game, you know that's the intro sequence, the title screen of the game, the music, the hinting of, moving forward in the world. Like that's exactly what we were looking for homage to the game.
Not to mention also the ending of the second video game, The Last of Us Part 2, also ends with a pano shot on a window looking out. So definitely a lot of homage there. Axel, you mentioned something that I think is very important, and I think we got to round out the episode with this before we say goodbye to our fans watching the show. But before we talk about what's coming in the episodes next, let's give our final grade for this episode. Axel, what's your final take on episode 3 of The Last of Us, titled Long, Long Time?
Mike, drum roll, please. And without further ado, I am going to give this a solid 9.0 A-. And let me tell you why. I'm going to break this down in numerical value. So, acting, characters, straight up 10 out of 10. That was phenomenal acting. That was Hollywood at its best. I really enjoyed the transition, the emotional weight, the conversations, the attention to detail. Man, that blew me away. I was in tears, y'all. That's how well that acting was done there. 10 out of 10. Now let's break this down on in terms of the score for the rest of the things. So we have the homage. That is going to get my lowest score, roughly between 8.5, 8.7. Again, this is the divergence between, the storyline of the game, the storyline to the TV show. While I think that it was much needed, our comparison is strictly on the facts. And that's why I think the divergence heavily downplayed on the comparison between the show and the game. Last but not least, we talk about the world. I think it was well portrayed. So for me, that's a good solid A, 9.3. Mike, what do you think?
I will give it a very similar grade. I think the significant divergence from the game is still done in a very honest, believable, and definitely, definitely an honest and believable portrayal of this story. Great amount of homage to the game as well, I would say, and it just in a very interesting arc that we're developing early on in this show. Have a lot of questions as to how the rest of it is going to go, but at least for this episode, I will give it a solid 9.6. So, a little bit better than straight in the middle. Anyway, let's round out this conversation, Axel. It's been awesome talking to you and recording another wonderful episode of Looking for the Light. I want to close out with just one quick mention of the fact that we are now officially a third of the way through the season. 9 episodes, 3 down, 6 more to go. And I got to say, Axel, I'm concerned. I don't know how they're going to be able to jam-pack the rest of the story into the show. We've got Pittsburgh, or what's going to be Kansas City. We've got the sewers. We've got the suburbs of Pittsburgh. We've got Wyoming. Tommy's Dam, as it's called in the video game. Then we have Eastern Colorado University. We have David's chapter. We have Left Behind. We have Salt Lake. And then we have the finale, if you will. That's a lot that they have to shove into the final 6 episodes. But something that you mentioned earlier, I want to hark on here, is this episode is definitely the first very, very big example, if you will, that The Last of Us HBO is not going to be one for one to the game. And we all knew that. We knew it was going to be different. But I think this episode, and a little bit of a hint of the last two episodes, is that there might be some condensing. There's definitely going to be some further character development and arcs to this story, I think. More introduction of complex characters that are going to add more to this world. But I think when you do add so much, it makes it very difficult to keep everything very grounded. So, how they're going to be able to condense that into 6 episodes, whether or not the show is going to end the same way that the game ends, is a very, very big question that I have. And I'm very excited to see how they build it out further. But one thing's for certain is Pittsburgh's up next, or Kansas City in this case, for the show. It's going to be very interesting to see what they do there. We'll probably get the introduction of Sam and Henry. Let's see what's going to happen. You know, this is going to be a very, very interesting divergence. I think we all need to brace ourselves for the divergence that's
Right.
about to happen. We're going to have to kind of take off our Last of Us Die Hard fandom fan hat off and let it kind of, hit us, and then digest it a little bit further on Thursdays, Fridays with us for Looking for the Light episodes, and see where we stand within the further development of the realm that is The Last of Us. Axel, what are your final takeaway thoughts for today's episode?
Final takeaway thoughts. Pittsburgh fans, if you feel as sad as I am about losing our city to the show, I hear you. I hear you loud and clear. Please put your comments, your thoughts about that. I would love to hear why you're upset, and if we should tell Neil to add it to a future iteration. I'm all for that.
Axel, no one wants to go to Schittsburg. What are you talking about?
Don't knock it till you try it.
Yins down there.
Don't
know nothing about The Last of Us.
Yins know what I'm talking about. Yins, the Steeler Nation needs to be out there. Here's what I'm gonna say.
No, ain't no Steeler Nation.
Steeler Nation. Here's what I'm gonna say.
I bet Heinz Field looks like what it did in The Dark Knight. It's all caved in and sad.
First mistake. Don't call it Heinz Field anymore. It ain't Heinz Field no more. So here's what's going to happen.
Good point.
I personally think that we're going to put a lot of faith into Neil's direction here. Neil has never ceased to surprise any one of us. Since he has 100% creative liberty to do what they want for this part of the show, I have full faith in him actually putting a lot of effort into the next 6 episodes. Here's what I also think. Nobody gives a damn about how much time we spent patiently going through the gameplay in those areas. Nobody is going to want to know of you hiding behind a building, but until you can actually pass through a bunch of enemies to get to the next area.
Right.
Realistically, we can probably skip, hundreds of hours of gameplay and context to just condense it into just a couple episodes at best, right? I also think that there is, for a better industry term, a lot of fluff in those areas. So this is actually a good chance for the creative team to condense the story and make it more relevant to what we're actually trying to portray. Love to see what they come up with. Also, when in the hell are they going to show a bloater? I went into this episode fully thinking we're going to see a bloater, and they're just going to pull a fast one on me. Guys, put your comments below and let us know exactly what you think for the next 6 episodes, because these next couple episodes are going to be probably one of the turning points. We're going to be introduced to whole new characters, a whole new world out there, outside of the little Boston, Massachusetts area we've seen so far. And on that note, Mike, you want to close us out for the next episode?
Yeah. I mean, I think you're not alone in this world, Axel, as far as people who are deathly excited to see a bloater. And there's quite a bit of rumor that we are going to come across a bloater in Kansas City in this show. So let's see if it happens. Everybody get all excited. get amped up because we have another episode coming on this Sunday, episode 4 of The Last of Us, titled Please Hold My Hand. Is this a song reference to the 80s again? Are we still going to keep on getting song references? Let's see. Anyway, guys, thank you so much for tuning in for another episode of Looking for the Light. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe down below. We'd love to get your comments, get some feedback from you guys. Love to have some discussions in the next episode. And thanks again for tuning in. My name is Michael Ablev. My host is Axel Hamill, and you have been listening to Looking for the Light. Thanks, y'all. See you next week.